There are stories that sound like they belong in novels, but in truth, they unfold quietly in the corners of real life, shaping the way people see dignity, arrogance, and justice. One such story began in the city of Brighton, where the wealthy often held themselves above the rest, and where appearances mattered more than almost anything else. Among these social circles lived Jonathan Whittaker, a businessman known for his money, his charm, and the subtle cruelty with which he treated people he considered beneath him. Jonathan was not a man without intelligence, but his intelligence had twisted over time into a kind of arrogance that allowed him to believe he could manipulate people and never face consequences. For years, he had built his image as a benefactor of the arts and community, throwing lavish parties, donating just enough money to keep his name in society pages, and cultivating friendships that would serve him in business and politics. Yet behind the scenes, many suspected that Jonathan's fortune was not as clean as it appeared. Rumors drifted through the city about mismanaged funds, missing accounts, and employees who left suddenly after years of service. Still, Jonathan maintained his facade, and few were willing to challenge him. It was during the planning of one of his grand charity galas that Jonathan decided to amuse himself in a particularly cruel way. He extended an invitation to Elena Johnson, a woman who had once worked as a housekeeper in his offices. Elena was known among staff for her quiet strength and dignity, but to Jonathan, she represented nothing more than an opportunity for mockery. He imagined how the wealthy guests would laugh to see a woman of her background wandering among gowns and tuxedos, out of place and uncomfortable. He relished the thought of her being the center of whispered jokes, all while he played the gracious host pretending to include her. But what Jonathan underestimated was that Elena had a history he did not fully understand, and a resilience he could never hope to match. When she received the invitation, she hesitated at first, aware that it was not extended in kindness. Yet something within her told her to accept, not to confront Jonathan directly, but to face the world that had for so long tried to push her into the shadows. She prepared carefully, not in defiance but in remembrance. The gown she chose was not borrowed or hastily purchased. It was a dress that had belonged to her late mother, Isabella, who had once been part of the Whittaker family before betrayal forced her out. On the night of the gala, the venue glittered with chandeliers, music, and carefully staged elegance. Guests arrived in their finest, eager to mingle and be seen. Jonathan moved through the room like a king surveying his court, shaking hands, laughing loudly, and ensuring all eyes rested on him. He was certain that his plan would succeed, that Elena's arrival would be a source of entertainment for the wealthy. But when the doors opened and Elena entered, the atmosphere shifted instantly. She carried herself with grace that silenced the room. The blue gown shimmered under the lights, and though it was modest in style, it held an undeniable weight of history. Her posture was steady, her expression calm, and as she moved across the hall, heads turned not in mockery, but in admiration. The whispers Jonathan expected were there, but they carried a tone of curiosity, even respect, rather than laughter. Jonathan forced a smile, trying to regain control of the moment. He greeted Elena loudly, drawing attention to her presence in hopes of turning the tide, but the tide had already shifted. As he introduced her to clusters of guests with a tone of mockery hidden beneath his words, Elena did not falter. She spoke with quiet confidence, answering questions and moving with the kind of assurance that only comes from someone who has endured much and still chosen dignity over bitterness. Then, as the evening unfolded, Elena revealed the deeper truth. In front of the gathered guests, she explained that the dress she wore had belonged to her mother, Isabella Whittaker, whose connection to the family had been deliberately erased by those who stood to gain from her absence. Gasps rippled across the hall, and Jonathan's expression faltered for the first time. To make matters worse, Elena produced an heirloom ring that had once belonged to Isabella, a piece of undeniable proof tying her to the very family Jonathan claimed to represent so proudly. The room grew tense. Guests who had long admired Jonathan looked to him for explanation, but his usual charm deserted him. He stammered, tried to laugh it off, but the whispers grew louder. What had begun as a prank to humiliate Elena was quickly becoming a revelation of Jonathan's own hidden history. Still, the night held more to come. Elena had not come simply to display a connection to the family. She had prepared documents, testimonies, and evidence of Jonathan's misconduct within his businesses, years of diverted funds, fraudulent accounts, and exploitation of those who trusted him. Slowly, carefully, she presented pieces of this truth. At first, guests reacted with disbelief, unwilling to imagine that the man they admired could be so corrupt. But as the evidence piled up, their doubt turned into outrage. Jonathan's composure cracked. His smile slipped, his voice grew defensive, and the more he tried to explain, the more trapped he became. His wife, Catherine, sat rigid, horror spreading across her face as she realized the empire they had built their lives around was built on lies. Friends who once toasted Jonathan began to step away, unwilling to be associated with him as the truth unfolded. Elena, however, remained composed. She had not come to scream or to humiliate. She had come to reclaim what was lost and to expose what had been hidden. Every detail she revealed had been prepared with precision, every word carrying the weight of years spent in silence. She stood not as a victim, but as a witness to truth. By the time the night drew to its climax, Jonathan's reputation lay in ruins. The gala that was supposed to strengthen his image had instead dismantled it. Elena had transformed the evening from a celebration of wealth into a reckoning of accountability. For the guests, the memory of Jonathan's charm would forever be overshadowed by the memory of his downfall. Yet Elena did not linger in the chaos. She left the hall with quiet dignity, her head held high, knowing she had honored her mother's memory and reclaimed a legacy that had been denied. Behind her, Jonathan was left in a haze of whispers and glares, his empire crumbling before his eyes. In the weeks after the gala, the story spread quickly across Brighton. Newspapers picked it up, not just for the scandal of Jonathan Whitaker's collapse, but for the remarkable presence of Elena Johnson, the woman who had stood her ground with such quiet conviction. For many, it was a story of justice long overdue. For others, it was a warning about the fragility of status built on deception. Jonathan tried to recover his reputation, issuing statements, denying some claims, and attempting to frame himself as a victim of misunderstanding. But the evidence Elena had revealed was far too detailed to dismiss. Former employees stepped forward, sharing their experiences of being mistreated, underpaid, or forced out when they questioned his methods. Business partners distanced themselves from him, and even political figures who once welcomed his donations began returning them publicly, eager to sever ties. Within months, the empire he had built over decades was in shambles. Meanwhile, Elena's life began to change in ways she had never expected. She had not planned for recognition. Her only intention had been to bring the truth to light and to honor her mother's name. But the media attention grew, and she found herself invited to speak at universities, conferences, and community centers. Journalists described her not just as the woman who exposed a fraud, but as someone who represented resilience in the face of systemic injustice. She accepted the attention carefully, never letting it distract her from what mattered. Elena used her newfound platform to create opportunities for others. With the support of allies who admired her courage, she established a foundation dedicated to providing scholarships, mentorship, and microloans to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Her vision was simple: to ensure that no one else would have to fight as hard as her mother had just to survive in a world stacked against them. The foundation grew rapidly, funded not by vanity, but by genuine contributions from those who believed in her mission. At the same time, Elena took steps to rebuild what Jonathan had destroyed. The company that had once been under his control was placed under investigation, and after legal proceedings, Elena assumed leadership as its rightful heir through her mother's lineage. Many employees who had left in frustration returned, hopeful for a workplace built on fairness rather than exploitation. Under Elena's guidance, the company shifted its focus. Profits remained important, but people mattered more. She introduced policies that prioritized employee welfare, flexible working conditions, and programs that reinvested earnings into the community. The transformation was not instant, and there were challenges along the way. Some investors doubted her abilities, dismissing her as inexperienced or too idealistic. But Elena met each challenge with persistence, leaning on her values rather than abandoning them. Over time, results spoke louder than skepticism. Productivity rose, employee loyalty deepened, and the company began to flourish in ways Jonathan had never achieved, precisely because its foundation was now rooted in trust rather than fear. Elena also began to heal personally. She bought a modest but beautiful home just outside the city, a place where she could finally breathe after years of uncertainty. The walls were filled with art that celebrated resilience and hope, reminders of the journey she had endured. She also opened her doors to two young girls from an orphanage, adopting them as her daughters. They reminded her of herself in earlier years, bright, eager, yet in need of stability and love. Raising them became one of the greatest joys of her life, giving her purpose beyond her professional role. The girls thrived under her care, growing up in an environment where empathy, education, and courage were valued above all. Elena encouraged them to pursue their passions, whether in art, science, or service. She wanted them to understand that dignity could not be taken by others and that true strength lay in choosing integrity even when no one was watching. In nurturing them, she also found healing for her own wounds, realizing that the cycles of pain and exclusion could be broken through love and guidance. Though Jonathan had been stripped of much of his wealth and influence, his shadow lingered. He wrote letters to Elena in private, some apologetic, others defensive. She read them, but chose not to respond. Forgiveness, she understood, was not a favor to be given on demand. It was a journey, one she would navigate in her own time. Yet, when Jonathan's children reached out to her, confused and ashamed by their father's actions, Elena welcomed them. She refused to let bitterness pass down another generation. Instead, she offered them connection, determined to show that compassion was not weakness but strength. As years passed, Elena's name became synonymous with ethical leadership. She was invited to speak at international summits, consulted on corporate reform, and featured in books that chronicled leaders who had changed industries not through fear, but through fairness. She never sought fame, but she accepted it as a tool to amplify the values she held dear. In every speech, she reminded audiences that wealth without integrity was nothing more than illusion, and that dignity could neither be bought nor stolen. The company she led thrived in ways analysts described as unprecedented. Beyond financial success, it became known for its culture of collaboration and respect. Employees, once silenced, now had a voice. Innovation flourished because people felt safe to share ideas. The ripple effects extended into the community as well. Scholarships supported education, partnerships funded shelters, and local businesses thrived under contracts that Jonathan would have dismissed as beneath him. For Elena, the greatest satisfaction came not from headlines or profits, but from walking through neighborhoods where children carried backpacks with her foundation's logo, knowing they had opportunities her mother could only dream of. She often visited schools, telling her story not as a tale of revenge, but as proof that adversity could be transformed into purpose. Students listened, inspired by the idea that circumstances did not define destiny. In quieter moments, Elena would sit in her garden, reflecting on the extraordinary path her life had taken. From being invited as a joke to standing as a symbol of justice, the journey had been long and heavy, but it had also been deeply meaningful. She knew that her mother, Isabella, would have been proud to see that the family legacy once stolen had not only been reclaimed but redefined. It was no longer about wealth or status. It was about building something that lifted others instead of crushing them. The story of Jonathan Whitaker became, in the end, a cautionary tale. He had tried to humiliate a woman he thought insignificant, but in doing so, he revealed his own corruption. Elena had not only survived his cruelty, but had transformed it into a moment that reshaped lives far beyond her own. His downfall was inevitable. But her rise was extraordinary because it was built not on pride, but on purpose. Those who once whispered about her with doubt now spoke her name with respect. Her journey became an example shared in classrooms, leadership seminars, and community halls. That resilience matters, that justice has a way of surfacing, and that true power belongs to those who use it to uplift others. Elena never saw herself as a heroine. She was simply a woman who refused to be defined by the limits others set for her. But in her refusal, she became more than she ever imagined. Proof that integrity, once chosen and lived fully, could change not only a life but an entire community. And so, the night that was meant to humiliate her became the spark of a legacy that would endure for generations, reminding anyone who heard it that dignity is unshakable when it is rooted in truth.